few elements of mystery and suspense fiction that are subject to more rules and regulations than the clue. And not surprisingly, stipulations surrounding the use of clues reached their height in the first half of the 20th century during the golden age of the puzzle mystery. In 1928, S.S. Van Dyne, a pseudonym for the American art critic Willard Huntington Wright, who was a master of this type of mystery, published an essay entitled 20 Rules for Writing Detective Stories. In it, he describes the detective story as a kind of intellectual game or sporting event that is bound by very definite laws. With regard to the use of clues, Van Dyne argues that the reader must have equal opportunity with the detective for solving the mystery. All clues must be plainly stated and described. In the same vein, Ronald Knox, a Catholic priest and author, published a detective story decalogue in 1929. The document consists of Knox's 10 commandments for the writing of detective fiction. Rule number 8 reads as follows: the detective must not light on any clues which are not instantly produced for the inspection of the reader. Even today, if you go to the internet and visit one of the many websites that offer advice to aspiring mystery and suspense fiction writers, you'll find that a lot of the information provided concerns the proper manufacturing and use of clues. And like their forebears, Van Dyne and Knox, the authors of these websites are particularly concerned with fair play. In other words, all these sources proceed from the assumption that the writer must use clues in such a manner that the reader may be misdirected but not tricked. The reader must always have access to all the information needed to solve the mystery successfully. In this lecture, we'll take a look at how clues have played a major role in developing some of the key definitional features of the mystery and suspense fiction genre. Over the course of the genre's history, clues take many different forms, depending upon the kind of mystery fiction we're reading. Sometimes they're physical, sometimes temporal or spatial, and at other times psychological. But despite the importance of clues, some forms of mystery and suspense fiction apparently make no use of clues at all. Therefore, we will also look at the reasons for the expendability of the clue in mysteries that focus instead on information about a criminal whose identity is already known to the reader. Finally, although the difference between the puzzle mystery on the one hand and the hard-boiled mystery on the other seem to sound a death knell for the clue, we'll conclude by examining how and why the clue has enjoyed a resurgence of popularity in recent years in forensic thrillers and television shows. But what is a clue? The word itself is a variant of the late Middle English word clue, spelled C-L-E-W, which referred to a ball of thread. If you remember your Greek mythology, you may remember the legend of Theseus and the Minotaur. When Theseus was tasked with slaying the Minotaur, Ariadne gave Theseus a ball of thread so that he could safely find his way back out of the labyrinth in which the Minotaur lived. In a similar manner, the mystery writer provides us with clues that we can use to find our way out of the fictional maze he or she has constructed. The only problem, of course, is that the mystery writer's clues may not be quite as reliable as Ariadne's ball of thread, because he or she also provides us with false clues that are designed to mislead us and send us off down the wrong path. If we now turn to the work of Edgar Allan Poe, the founder of the genre, we'll find a treasure trove of information and advice about how to think through the role of clues in mystery and suspense fiction. In Poe's first mystery tale, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, his detective, Auguste Dupin, is investigating the murder of Madame and Mademoiselle L'Espanaye. On the whole, Poe is very careful about making sure that the reader has access to the same information that Dupin has during the investigation. For example, one of Dupin's major sources of evidence is newspaper accounts of the crime, as it will be in Poe's next story, The Mystery of Marie Roget. In both stories, rather than just summarizing these newspaper accounts, Poe makes sure to reproduce them in full so that the reader starts from the same place as the detective. In both cases, Poe is issuing an unspoken challenge to the reader. My detective solved the case using this resource. Can you do the same? With this said, Rue Morgue also contains some moments that later writers in the genre probably would not consider fair play. For example, although we're told that Dupin examines the crime scene minutely, we aren't told exactly what he's looking at, which leaves us at something of a disadvantage. A much more notorious example of us not receiving information that Van Dyne and Knox would have recommended sharing with the reader immediately comes later in Rue Morgue. At this point, Dupin has already figured out what's happened, and he is explaining to the narrator how he solved the mystery. Part of Dupin's explanation involves the newspapers, which we did have access to, but the majority of his explanation concerns how he arrived at the conclusion that the murderer entered and exited the locked apartment through the window. And there's no way that we could possibly have figured that out from the information that we were given. Much more egregious, however, is the moment when Dupin triumphantly reveals the clue that enabled him to deduce that the murders had been committed by an orangutan, namely some orangutan fur that Dupin removed from the clenched fist of one of the victims. Whenever I teach Poe, this moment inevitably provokes howls of outrage from my students, and you can see why. We're never shown this vital clue until the moment Dupin produces it. Without it, there's no way we could ever have solved the mystery. With it, we might feel, with some justification, that we could have arrived at the same conclusion as Dupin. Ironically then, given the emphasis that later mystery and suspense fiction writers place on fair play, it would seem that the founder of the genre does not play fair with his readers at all. We should, of course, cut Poe some slack here. Bearing in mind the fact that he was inventing a genre, we can say he was obviously not bound by anyone else's rules. More importantly, even though Dupin kept the orangutan fur to himself, this should not blind us to the fact that Poe's stories tell us a number of valuable things about clues that would influence the genre profoundly. Take, for example, the fact that the notorious orangutan fur is a physical object. Does this imply that clues will always be objects, and that physical evidence is what we should look for in trying to solve a mystery? Poe would reply, not at all. For example, in The Mystery of Marie Roget, Dupin is investigating the murder of a young woman whose body was pulled from the River Seine in Paris. When, sometime after the murder, a number of items belonging to the victim are discovered, we might assume that this is a vital clue. Dupin disagrees, not only because he believes that the evidence was planted, but also because he feels that the key clues in this case consist not so much of physical objects, but instead of gaps and absences in the story. Appropriately, therefore, Poe presents us with these clues in the form of newspaper stories, but these stories are not accounts of the murder itself, but rather of events that at first glance appear to have nothing to do with the Marie Roget case at all. Just as he does in Rue Morgue, in Marie Roget, Poe presents us with these clues explicitly by quoting the newspaper articles in full, Again, the challenge to the reader is as follows. Here is the key to solving the mystery. Can you see what makes it the key? So, according to Poe, clues will not always present themselves as obviously as a clump of orangutan fur. Sometimes detecting clues has as much, if not more, to do with how you look rather than what you're looking at. Poe drives this point home even more clearly in his third and final mystery tale, The Purloined Letter, a story that revolves around the recovery of a physical object. The prefect of the Parisian police fails utterly in his search for the stolen letter precisely because he applies the wrong type of vision to his search. The prefect assumes that valuable clues must always be hidden away in a secret place, and so his search proceeds on that basis. Dupin starts from a very different point because he realizes that the most valuable clue in this case is the psychology of the person who committed the crime. Dupin understands the minister's personality, and so he understands that he would never use any of the usual methods of hiding the letter. This is what allows Dupin to deduce that the minister is hiding the letter in plain sight. Once he realizes this, Dupin is able to solve the case. In just 3 stories, then, Poe demonstrates a wide variety of ways in which clues can be defined and used in mystery and suspense fiction. Throughout the 3 tales, Poe's emphasis is on creativity and variety. The writer, the detective, and the reader all need to be aware of the need to think outside the box in terms of both creating and discovering clues. With this advice in mind, we can now turn to the work of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie to see how they extend even further the role that clues play in the genre. Consider, for example, one of the most ritualistic elements of a Sherlock Holmes story, that moment when he meets his client for the first time and is able to immediately decipher that client's personality, occupation, and history from details of their appearance, such as marks on their boots, mud on their dress, the size of their hands, or an obscure tattoo. Holmes's skill comes partly from his highly developed observational powers, which underlines Poe's point about the importance of how one looks. But it also suggests that literally anything can be a clue, depending on the context. At first glance, it might seem as if the Holmes stories think of clues primarily as physical objects. In her groundbreaking 1913 book, The Technique of the Mystery Story, the critic Carolyn Wells surely has Holmes in mind when she comments that tiny clues are a favorite device of the detective story writer. There is a fascination about the solving of a big murder mystery by a bit of a broken cufflink, or the tracing of a professional burglar by a speck of cigarette ash. When we recall the number of Holmes stories that involve him on his hands and knees with his magnifying glass looking for clues, we can see the justice of Wells's remarks. Wells is also very helpful when she goes on to describe why this type of clue and the detective who is able to perceive it is so popular with readers. Because these tiny clues go unnoticed by both the amateur observer and the police. When they're discovered, they redound to the glory of the transcendent detective. But although Holmes is undoubtedly very accomplished at finding the tiny clues of which Wells speaks, it's important to note that his skills go further than this. In The Adventure of Silver Blaze, for example, Holmes is investigating the theft of the eponymous racehorse on the eve of a big race. The story includes this famous bit of dialogue between Holmes and Gregory, a Scotland Yard detective. Gregory says, "Is there any other point to which you wish to draw my attention?" Holmes replies, "To the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime." Gregory says the dog did nothing in the nighttime, and Holmes concludes that was the curious incident. Holmes realizes that sometimes absence rather than physical presence can be a clue. In this case, the fact that the dog did not bark when the horse was being stolen allows Holmes to deduce that the thief must have been a familiar figure. This is a wonderful example of creative thinking about clues on the part of both Doyle and his detective. We can find many examples of the same kind of ingenuity in the work of Agatha Christie. And with her, it's even more striking because in many cases she imposes such restraints on herself. What restraints am I referring to? Think of the popular board game Clue. Not only is it wonderful evidence of the importance of clues to mystery fiction, but it's also a kind of tribute to Christie's mastery of a particular example of the genre, the country house mystery. Working with a small cast of characters in a spatially limited environment made it challenging for Christie to come up with new variations on the clue mystery again and again. The fact that she was able to do so over a period of many years is a testament to her amazing creativity and ingenuity. Bearing in mind the spatial and character restraints that she imposed on herself, we should also note that many of Christie's clues have something to do with the normal order of things being disturbed in some way. This is partly why there are so many maps and drawings in Christie's country house mysteries. By definition, these mysteries are set in an environment where order usually reigns and where everything has its proper place. The eruption of murder in this environment disrupts this order, and so, appropriately, the resolution to the situation can often be found in those tiny details that are out of the ordinary. In the murder of Roger Ackroyd, for example, a chair that is out of position in the room where the murder took place turns out to be a crucial clue for Hercule Poirot. Now, even though Christie is probably most closely associated with a highly formulaic type of mystery fiction that thinks about clues in a traditional sense, I want to emphasize that not only was she more creative than a lot of her fans give her credit for, but that she could also get quite frustrated by having to depend on traditional types of clues in her books. In the ABC murders, for example, Poirot is faced with a case that doesn't seem to obey any of the usual rules. The killer is killing people seemingly at random, and although he leaves an ABC railway guide at the scene of each murder, which seems to be a very obvious clue, it's not at all clear what the meaning of that clue might be. As the case progresses, Poirot becomes more and more convinced that the key to this case is the psychology of the murderer, which makes this novel quite unusual in the Christie canon. We should also note that Poirot becomes more and more frustrated with his somewhat dim-witted friend and sidekick, Captain Hastings, who is incapable of doing the kind of lateral thinking that Poirot is convinced is needed in this case, and who instead is still obsessed with physical clues. So, when Hastings laments the fact that the murderer hasn't left behind any clues, Poirot says to him quite sharply, "Yes, the clue. It is always the clue that attracts you. Alas, that he did not smoke the cigarette and leave the ash and then step in it with a shoe that has nails of a curious pattern. No, he is not so obliging." I don't think it's too much of a stretch to read this passage not only as evidence of Poirot's frustration with Hastings, but also as evidence of Christie's frustration with her readers, who expected from her the same kind of mystery with the same types of clues over and over again. It's amusing to note that when Poirot solves the mystery at the end of the novel, he claims that a fingerprint on a typewriter was the essential piece of evidence that proved the murderer's guilt. Hastings, with his fondness for the physical clue, jumps on this detail immediately, and the following dialogue between Hastings and Poirot ensues. "That fingerprint clinched things, Poirot. He went all to pieces when you mentioned that." "Yes, they are useful, fingerprints. I put that in to please you, my friend." "But Poirot, wasn't it true?" "Not in the least, mon ami." The invented fingerprint is a joke, not only at Hastings' expense, but also at the expense of any reader who is traditional or unimaginative enough to only think of clues as physical, tangible objects, rather than as a category that can take a variety of different forms. And yet, despite Christie's insistence on the importance of extending one's thinking about clues beyond the conventional limits of the category, she never calls into question the importance of the clue itself for the type of mystery she's writing. There's a good reason for that. Whenever one is writing a puzzle mystery that is a variation on the whodunit, some kind of clue to the mystery is essential. The genre literally cannot do without it. How then did mystery and suspense fiction break away from what we might describe as the tyranny of the clue and strike out into territory where clues either radically changed their form or weren't even necessary at all? The answer to this question lies in the emergence of the hard-boiled mystery. When Dashiell Hammett's character, the Continental Op, arrives in Personville in Red Harvest to wrest control of the town away from the gangsters who currently run it, he has neither the time nor the inclination to look for clues about how to get the job done. Instead, he gets straight to work, which in this case means getting people to kill each other, killing a fair number of people himself, and generally laying waste to the town until he's the last man standing. No clues needed. In a similar vein, in Fast One, the criminally underread only novel from short story and screenwriter Paul Kane, protagonist Jerry Kells rejects the offer of gangster Jack Rose to join forces with him against Lee Fenner, another local crime boss. When Rose then double-crosses Kells because he now sees him as a threat, Kells goes on the offensive and turns the LA underworld upside down in the process. In doing so, Kane makes sure that Fast One lives up to its title. Its pace is absolutely relentless, and neither the characters nor the reader have time to breathe, let alone look for and consider the meaning of clues before the horribly bleak ending. It comes as no surprise that no less a writer than Raymond Chandler described Fast One as some kind of high point in the ultra-hard-boiled manner. Cornell Woolrich, the master of the suspense novel, also had little time for clues in much of his work. Although his novels are not as furiously paced as Kane's Fast One, they frequently contain a time element that dictates a certain urgency on the part of the characters. In The Black Angel, for example, Alberta Murray is in a race against time to prove that her husband is innocent of the murder he's been charged with. And in The Bride Wore Black, a police detective is trying to discover why a woman is slowly killing off a group of men before she eliminates all of them. In these novels, as in much of Woolrich's work, Every other element of the work, including, all too often, plausibility, is subordinated to what Woolrich called the line of suspense. Analysis of clues counts for very little. Instead, the pressure of time, the need for motion, and relentless activity are the main means by which suspense is generated. Finally, in the work of Elmore Leonard, there's very little in the way of clues, even though his work has a far more leisurely pace than that of Hammett, Kane, or Woolrich. But Leonard's novels, which often revolve around heists, cons, or capers of one kind or another, invest their time not in planting and then deciphering clues, but rather in developing characters, something Agatha Christie, for example, is notoriously uninterested in. The types of pleasure that readers derive from reading the various kinds of hard-boiled mystery and suspense fiction, in other words, are very different from the pleasures of the puzzle mystery. While clues are essential to the puzzle mystery, they're largely irrelevant to hard-boiled writers. And yet, this is not quite the whole story. Even in some hard-boiled mysteries, clues appear, albeit in a different form. And when they do, they often provide interesting examples of self-referential commentary on the genre itself. In Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon, for example, it could be argued that the falcon itself is a kind of clue that begs to be interpreted and understood, if only because everyone in the novel is fascinated by it. It's hard to say for sure, but the fact that the falcon turns out to be fake might be Hammett's way of commenting on the illusory importance of the clue in mystery and suspense fiction. Staying with The Maltese Falcon, one of the most famous and hotly debated parts of the novel is the so-called Flitcraft story that Detective Sam Spade tells Bridget O'Shaughnessy. The story involves a man named Flitcraft who's walking down the street one day when he narrowly avoids being hit by a beam that fell from a building that was under construction. Hammett describes the impact the incident has on Flitcraft. He felt like somebody had taken the lid off life and let him see the works. Flitcraft responds to the shock by immediately abandoning his family and job and then disappearing into thin air. When Spade finds him years later after being hired by Flitcraft's wife, he finds that Flitcraft has basically built another life that is almost a carbon copy of his previous life. Spade mentions to Bridget that this was his favorite detail about the story. The Flitcraft story doesn't appear to have any connection with any other events in the novel, but for this very reason, Hammett's reader is tempted to read the Flitcraft story as a clue and try to fathom its meaning. At the very least, the fact that Spade tells the story indicates the extent to which, in a hard-boiled tale, the detective can be as much a source of mystery as the one that solves mysteries. A more unambiguous example of a clue in a hard-boiled novel can be found in Chester Himes's 1965 novel, Cotton Comes to Harlem. In the process of investigating the theft of $87,000 from poor Harlem families, Himes's tough-as-nails protagonists, black police detectives Coffin Ed Johnson and Gravedigger Jones, come across some threads of cotton in the back of a van that will actually turn out to be a vital clue. Even though Coffin Ed is struck by how unusual and suggestive the presence of cotton in Harlem is, Gravedigger comments dismissively, "Leave it to the fingerprinters and other experts," and the detectives move on. In this way, Himes slyly implies that even when traditional clues do show up in a hard-boiled novel, the novel's protagonists can easily overlook their significance because they aren't expecting to find them. I'd like to take those threads of cotton in Himes' novel and imagine what the forensic team in CSI would have made of them. As unlikely as this conjunction might seem, I would argue that what connects them is the persistence of the clue in mystery and suspense narratives. Thanks to the popularity of shows like the CSI franchise, the novels of Patricia Cornwell with their medical examiner protagonist Kay Scarpetta, and Kathy Reichs's Temperance Brennan novels, and the TV show Bones, both of which feature forensic anthropologists, the clue, especially in its physical form, has enjoyed a resurgence of popularity in recent years. Why is this? Partly because these novels and television series all share an emphasis on updating the venerable status of the clue in the genre by means of the latest cutting-edge developments in science and technology. Bearing in mind the fact that Sherlock Holmes is first introduced to us in A Study in Scarlet as a scientist, it's clear that mystery fiction and science have a long relationship. Forensic crime narratives both draw upon and renew that history while also using scientific details to generate plots and provide solutions. With that last point in mind, I would say that the main reason for the clue's renewed popularity is that it speaks to our desire to have mystery and suspense narratives provide us with a sense of resolution. Hard-boiled tales are notorious for their open-endedness and pessimism about whether change, improvement, and resolution are ever possible, and even, in a more fundamental sense, whether the world can ever be made to make sense. Given this worldview, such narratives regard clues as unnecessary because they imply the existence of a mystery that can be solved. Although many readers and viewers appreciate what they see as the realism of hard-boiled pessimism, just as many people want and need their mystery and suspense narratives to provide them with the sense that the world, despite appearances, is not irredeemably random and chaotic. The persistence of our enthusiasm for those who patiently collect and analyze clues, no matter what form they come in, and who then use those clues to solve the mystery, speaks to both the social utility of mystery and suspense fiction and our enduring need for answers.